Hey there, fam. Grateful for you joining this live interview. This is another in the podcast series of Primal Polarity. Today I'm bringing in an amazing brother. He is a men's sex pleasure and mentor. Many of you will know him, Cam Fraser. He's a legend from down under. I'm going to bring him on screen here. And if you're watching this video live, do type in a comment, type in a question, share where you're tuning in from. If you're watching later, type in replay and be sure to tag somebody and share this video. Getting big value. What's good, brother?
Hey, my bro. I'm good, dude. How are you?
Really good, man. This has been long overdue. I've been following your work for years and so grateful to be here with you, man.
Oh, that's so lovely, man. I really appreciate it. I've been a big follower of yours and love the stuff you're putting out into the world. So it's really nice to be able to connect with you like this, mate.
Yeah, this is going to be a good one. I can feel it. So Cam, brother, what's the bio intro for you for folks that maybe aren't familiar with your work? How would you describe it?
Okay. So I'm a men's sex coach. I specifically.
I think I lost your audio there, brother. I don't know if you can hear me. Can't hear you though. Can you hear me? Oh, there we go. Yeah. I think your mic went out for a second. Can you hear me?
I was getting phone calls. My accountant calling me, mate.
Oh, classic.
There's something going on. But I'll start again. So I'm a men's sex coach. I work specifically with cisgender heterosexual men. That's my demographic, and it's what I speak into with the most authority, I suppose. And I try and blend esoteric teachings and spiritual practices with like some really grounded, scientifically accurate information. I really think there's a lot of value in both of these worlds, like the spiritual, esoteric, mystery tradition world, and like the Western medicine, scientific approach to sexuality. Michael Foucault would say like ars erotica and scientia sexualis, like these two approaches to sexuality. I think they both have a lot of merit, and I really do my best to try and integrate those two things because I've learned a lot from both of those spaces. So that's my approach to sexuality and my approach to the work that I do. A lot of the stuff that I talk about is stuff that I wish I'd heard 10, 15 years ago when I was a younger man, like it's just me speaking to a younger version of myself. So it's really, really humbling that it resonates with other people.
Yeah, I love that perspective. It's the stuff we wish we knew 10 years ago when we started our, sexual activity and dating lives. It's so wild to me, and this came up with my book and co-authors and so many interviews of how lacking sexual education is in general, especially for male sexuality. I mean, there's some stuff out there for female sexuality, but in school or in university, this isn't even touched. Like there's no conversation around this stuff. And I'm curious, obviously here in the West, US, UK, Australia, Canada, we don't talk about it. And why is that? Like, what's your theory or experience around that, around education?
Look, a good example of this, I totally agree with what you're propositioning, and something that I see, like even in like the medical and sexual health space as an example of this is like we still use a model of sexual response for men, right? It's a male sexual response model from the 1960s that was developed by Masters and Johnson, and we still use that today for diagnosing and
Wow.
analyzing like male sexual function. And so that's 50 plus years, I suppose, that we've been using this model, and it's so linear, it's so narrow, inflates orgasm with ejaculation. It doesn't talk about prostate orgasms, which don't include an ejaculation. It talks about like, male sexuality and desire being spontaneous as opposed to being responsive. It's very like straightforward and simple, and like this is how it is, and that's just how men experience their sexuality. And we know, as you and I know, but people in general, we know collectively that male sexuality is a lot more diverse and a lot more nuanced than this like really linear model portrays it to be. But, and here's why, to answer your question, here's why I think we haven't really updated and revised that model like we have with female sexual response, which has been critically reviewed and revised about 16 times in the last years. And we've got this really beautiful, nuanced model, which takes into consideration a lot of other things, which you don't really have for men, is because I think there's this societal messaging or perception or stereotype that men just like, you know, they get an erection, they jerk off, they ejaculate, and that's it. And there's no strings attached. It's like just purely physical. They just go through the motions. It means nothing to them. You know, that's perpetuated by Hollywood movies. It's perpetuated by porn. It's perpetuated by your mates, right? The lack of conversations that we have around sexuality as men, the lack of sex education. So all that I see like perpetuating the lack of investigation into male sexual responses and sexual like experiences in the scientific community, right? And so why it'd be beneficial to have, you know, a foot in both worlds is because there's so much amazing stuff happening in like the sacred sexuality spaces, the neo-tantric spaces around like expanding experiences of sexual response and sexual pleasure, which is like totally not being looked at from the kind of scientific perspective. And I think there'd be so much to get from integrating some of that into the neo-tantric and sacred sexuality space. But for the most part, I think it's just societal messaging, man. Like we just perpetuate that. And as guys, we do it as well. I did myself, right? Growing up, I was like, sex is just this no strings attached, just going through the motions. Thanks for coming. See you later. And you know, my mates thought sex and masturbation was supposed to be like as well. If you deviated from that, you were considered weird, or you were considered strange, or like, God forbid, you were exploring your ass, right, and maybe doing some prostate stimulation, then you'd be labeled gay or some other a big slur, right? And so man, I'm dropping out all over the place. So this fear and this insecurity keeps people limited, right? It keeps people perpetuating these really, you know, old paradigm stories, as I like to call them. So yeah, I think like a lot of it is mental, man, and it's like the stories that we keep on perpetuating, and I think that's really limiting our experiences.
100%. And to me, it's just baffling, and it almost begs the question of like, is this by design of how sexuality, and not just sexuality, right? There's like the anatomy and the physical apparatus, but you know, emotional intimacy, communication, EQ, you know, how to navigate relationship, how to navigate, you know, family units and your community. None of this is even touched, right? Like we get like one little, we all have the classic class. I mean, I don't know how it was in Australia, but in America, it's like literally one day in PE, you just get like the diagrams of like genitals and a basic explanation of how pregnancy works. And then it's never really touched again unless you like majored in that, right? And that's informal education. Of course, there's like the locker room version of that. And to me, it's absurd that, you know, a lot of men think that ejaculation is all there is, obviously. And that's the value, as you said, of the tantric spaces and the sacred sexuality spaces. And obviously Mantak Chia and a lot of these folks have done a lot to really, you know, get that word out there about the male sexual experience and how it can be as multidimensional as the female sexual experience in a different way. But I'm curious for you, Cam, like, what would you say is the impact of what you just described? Like, how are men experiencing their sexual lives, and what are their major struggles, especially in relationship?
Yeah, I want to like first dive into that. You know, you said like, is this by design? And you know, I don't necessarily think. I mean, I know that there are some teachers out there who will say 100% yes, it's by design. They're squashing sexual expression, and I think, you know, to an extent there is like a sexuality is demonized and we shouldn't explore it. And so I do think that's in our culture. But something that I see in men and their experience of sexuality in particular is like, and we'll call it like a late stage capitalism mentality, right? Like bleeding into their sexual experiences. And what I mean by that is like, you know, masturbation and sex for a lot of guys has to produce something, has to achieve something, has to have an end product, right? Like, you know, capitalism does. It's got to like always be producing, achieving, moving towards something. It's got to be, you know, productive. And we shouldn't waste any time, because time is money. And, you know, we've always got to be grinding and hustling. And I see a lot of men's coaches doing this as well. It's like hustle mindset, hustle culture, hustle fucking, you know, grinding, whatever. There's no time for like self-care, pleasure, rest, like taking the time to be in the moment and enjoying that experience. And so when guys take that mentality into their experience of sexuality, when it's alone, for example, it's like, I just got to masturbate, I got to get an erection, I got to get an ejaculation, I've got to, go through this process to get to this experience. And oftentimes, if that's not available to them, either because they are struggling to get an erection or they can't come, or like, I challenge a lot of guys to experiment with not ejaculating as well. So when they start to challenge that story of like sex and masturbation has to produce something, they come against that story, right? And they go, oh shit, sex is now, what does sex mean? Like, if it's not an end goal, of ejaculation or penetration or orgasm, like, it kind of forces them to ask the question, well, does that mean sex is unsuccessful for me now? Does that mean that sex didn't produce or achieve anything? Like, what does that mean about my sexual experiences now? And so I definitely see like that being the impact of like the culture around male sexuality in particular, is like, guys are very goal oriented when it comes to sex. And so they'll push penetration, they'll push for ejaculation, they'll try and, not necessarily force their partners to have orgasms, but like there's this like mentality that like men are the ones that are like supposed to give their partners orgasms, and kind of like in this really convoluted way, like take away agency from their partners, and rather than like collaborating with them on the experience of orgasm and pleasure. And so a lot of guys are really good at gratification, because it's like the goal is just like get something that's gratifying and get that squirt of dopamine and get that experience. But a lot of guys aren't very good at like deep, intimate experiences of pleasure, like surrender, letting go, and just opening up to experience of pleasure, because pleasure is it's oftentimes like framed as something weak, right? Pleasure is like weakness, or it's effeminate, or it's feminine, right, womanly, and it's not masculine, right? That's a very common story I see in like men's coaching spaces, is that pleasure is kind of demonized as this thing that you don't need. And so a lot of guys close themselves off to that and just go for the gratification, right? It's easy to get like, that ejaculation. It's easy to get that. It's easy to just go like that. And, you were talking about like emotional intimacy and things like that before. Like, experiencing pleasure in that deep, embodied way is a really vulnerable thing to do, especially when you're not with a person. Like, letting go and being in that can bring up insecurity and all these other emotional aspects. And so guys close themselves off to that, not only because of the kind of like capitalistic, kind of consumeristic way that I've been talking about sex and masturbation, but also because there's not a lot of encouragement for men to explore those really beautiful emotional experiences and expressions. And so they close themselves up to that as well. And they just go through this way of experiencing, masturbation and sex in this very simple, straightforward, linear way that's reinforced with shame and, homophobic slurs and all this other shit that's out there, just like keeping people playing small with regards to their masturbation and sex.
Totally. The by design thing is an interesting question. Obviously, sexuality has been taboo for pretty much all of human history that we know of. And, more recently it's been placed, it's kind of a mindfuck, right? Because sexuality on one level, like everything's over sexualized, like hyper sexualized, like marketing, and speaking about late stage capitalism, it's like, boom, sex sells, it's everywhere, especially the female form. And yet, we're not encouraged to go deep in sexuality. And like, if you went to your doctor, right, like a mainstream doctor, and I love that you combine science and the like, alternative to that, mystic arts, whatever you want to call it. If you went to your normal doctor, right, your MD or your GP, and you're just like, hey, like, I'm having trouble with sexuality, I need to get an erection more often, or I have premature ejaculation, or this is happening with my wife, or whatever. A lot of the interventions are pharmaceutical or like psychiatric, right? So it's like, oh, well, here's this pill that's going to help you get an erection. Or, well, let's actually do a psychiatric evaluation because maybe you're, fucked in the head, and that's why you can't experience sex and intimacy. And for me, going deeper into the tantric side of things, especially the Taoist style, which I've really gained a lot of, amazing teaching practice and experience from, is like your body, you know, much like the psychedelic experience, your body is this endless, multi-dimensional like place where you can experience profound healing and altered states, and you know, just gnosis, right? Just that self-knowing knowledge, whatever. And it's an inner journey. And I think I agree. Most men would say like, oh, like hustle, hustle, hustle. Why do I need that? That's for women, right? Exploring pleasure, sexuality, that inner world. And for you, Cam, like you know, I saw some questions coming up here, and thank you for everyone joining us here live. What would you tell a man? Like, do you recommend traditional medical, you know, advice, or would you more recommend, you know, practices like you mentioned, like practicing semen retention, right, as a starting point?
Yeah, I tried to. I appreciate you bringing all that up, man, because there's so much that I'd love to dive into, like to speak into a little bit of it. You know, the what I see is like male sexuality. I mean, sexuality in general, but like particularly male sexuality, we've really like reduced down to function. You know, and I see this in the messages that I receive from men on a day-to-day basis. Like, a lot of guys who are self-diagnosing themselves with premature ejaculation or erectile dysfunction or low libido, right? Like, they've never been to a clinician. They've never actually, you know, those are clinical diagnoses that you have to meet criteria for. But like, that's the language that we use to describe sexual concerns, right? And so a lot of guys, you know, take that messaging on. They go, oh, I've got premature ejaculation. I've got this condition, right? This dysfunction. And, you know, it, like the language around, you know, going from dysfunctional to functional again, like a fucking machine, right? Like you've got to go in to a mechanic for a tune-up, and then, you know, you become a functional apparatus again. Right? That's the way we've conceptualized the body from that like medical perspective, right? So there's like over medicalization and over pathologization of like male sexuality, because you get like one experience of losing your erection, now you've got erectile dysfunction, right? And like that's the language guys have, is like, you know, I've got this dysfunction of like that I've got to try and fix. I'm broken. And that's perpetuated very much so by like the pharmaceutical industry, as you pointed out. Like the amount of money and campaigning in Viagra, for example, in America, in like the late 90s and early 2000s, was like hammering this message of like, if you've got any sign of erection issues, like you need this pharmaceutical intervention. And like even the way that we research erection issues, for example, all the questionnaires that we use to ask men about their experience of erection problems were funded by Viagra and their subsidiaries. So we're using this tool to ask men about their erection issues from a company that sells erectile dysfunction medication, right? So there's a massive conflict of interest in the way that we like ask men about their experiences. But we do it for convenience sake, right? Because it's like easier to just like have this questionnaire than it is to sit down with the guy, explore like erectile disappointment with him, like explore the nuances of the sexual experience. It's much easier to like mass send out this questionnaire and just get feedback that way. And so we do it because we kind of have to, and there is an alternative, but it's like a very time consuming and very efficient alternative, unfortunately, right? So we've kind of given up the kind of deeper understanding for convenience and for like mass production, and that's like a wider cultural thing, I think. But yeah, so I wanted to speak into that, man. That's like a perfect example of like, you know, there is kind of an agenda there, pharmaceutical agenda to get guys to take medication. And we're seeing it now. I mean, I'll rant about this all day. We're seeing it now with like, now you can buy medication online and you can do a consult with a doctor. Like I went through the process because I wanted to check it out with one of the major ones here in Australia. And they didn't even ask me. They just said like, hey, you know, do you have erectile issues? I was like, put it in. Yep. And they're like, sweet, here's some medication. And I was like, oh, they didn't even check, right?
Wow.
Like, I didn't consult with the doctor. The doctor apparently looked over it, but I don't fucking know. And then they just send it to me in the mail. So it's like the way that but this is touted as like this really positive thing, right? It's like really progressive. Like, look, we're speaking about male sexuality. It's like out there. These companies are advertising at the cricket and, you know, on billboards in the streets. And it's like, great, we're talking about men's sexual experiences. But really, are we talking about the positive way, or are we reinforcing this like dysfunctional, you know, pathological, medicalized version of sexuality? I would argue that we're doing the latter, right? We're just reinforcing, go and take this pill, go and get this quick fix, you know, slap a band-aid on it. Don't actually look at the root causes of your issues. So, so my a long answer to your question. But so my approach is, okay, let's take a biopsychosocial approach to this, right? Let's have a look at your biology. Let's check out what's going on. Do you have maybe some low testosterone levels that are contributing to your experience of erection issues, or your experience of fatigue, which is detracting from your desire to be sexual, right? Do you have maybe some serotonin or dopamine issues going on? Are you taking SSRIs, for example? There's a whole bunch of stuff in the last couple of years around SSRI-induced sexual dysfunction,
Right.
because SSRIs are really fucking with people's serotonin, dopamine, and that's having sexual impacts. So are they taking medication? Like, what about their nervous system? Like, do they have specific nervous system issues, or maybe their vasculogenic issues? So maybe their erections are a result of plaque buildup, right? So we need to actually, talk about, maybe they've got diabetes. We need to talk about the biological, perspective, and there's value in that. I think it's important. And I hate people that say, come to me and I'll cure your erection issues, no problem. Like, as if one approach to all erection issues. And it's just like,
Right.
it's disingenuous in my opinion, because there's so many different reasons. But then it's like, okay, let's look at the psychological reasons as well, right? Let's look at the experience of anxiety and the experience of trauma, and maybe how that's impacting your sexual experience, right? Anxiety, erection issues and ejaculation are two sides of the same coin, with that coin being anxiety. Right? That anxiety manifests as tension in your body. That tension results in you coming quicker, or it results in inhibiting erections and inhibiting engorgement. And so it's like, all right, let's deal with the anxiety. And that anxiety might be coming from like past previous quote unquote negative experiences, right? Maybe a traumatic experience, or maybe a time when they, were shamed by a like that. And it's like, let's look at the social issues. And I kind of touched on this before. What are the conditionings around sexuality? Like, do guys have this idea that they're supposed to be penetrative and assertive and dominant in the bedroom? And I would argue that yes, a lot of guys think that's what it means to be a sexual man, is to be this like, powerful, virile figure. And I see that perpetuated by some divine masculine as well, right? This kind of divine masculine is penetrative and is purposeful and is like on mission and things like that. And it's still, repackaged in a way. And so when guys like they don't live up to that societal condition around what it means to be a sexual man, that causes some sexual concerns for them, and it inhibits their ability to like open up a bit more and to be vulnerable. That's like not society acceptable and things like that. So my approach is very different depending on where I feel like that particular client. But some broad strokes suggestions that I give to men. The first is, cultivate a self-pleasure practice. And what I mean by this is start to move away from like just the run-of-the-mill masturbation that a lot of guys do. I speak to a lot of men about the way that they masturbate. It's typically one of three ways. It's like sitting in front of a computer screen, hunched over, one hand, mouse in the other, scrolling through their favorite tube site and just going through the motions. It's very like heady. They close down, they're stagnant, they're stationary. I don't know if you've ever seen a chimpanzee jerk off, but it's like that. It's actually scarily and they're just like, furiously masturbating. The other way is like, on their phone, sitting on the bed or something, swiping, maybe on social media, going through TikTok or whatever. The next is like in the shower, and it's just behind closed doors, standing up, but like masturbating as quickly as possible so you don't waste water and get the water corporation knocking on your door. And it's just like very sedentary, very stationary. It's very like genital focused, like it's hyper fixated on the cock. And it's like friction based as well, right? It's like very up and down friction based. So my suggestion to like anyone, but particularly like the men that I work with and the men that resonate with like my content, is like start to broaden your experiences of masturbation. And I like to reframe it to self-pleasure, right? Because masturbation has a lot of connotations. It's very much like, whenever I talk about masturbation, people always think I'm also talking about pornography, because the two are oftentimes hand in hand for guys. And so I like to reframe and use the term self-pleasure, because the term itself is so open, right? Like, it's like, what do you yourself find pleasurable? That may include watching porn. That may include stimulation, but it doesn't have to, right? Like, what do you in this moment find pleasurable? And it's about cultivating a relationship with pleasure, really, rather than, solely on gratification. So like a very simple strategy for that is like, and I tell this to everyone that will listen, is start to explore the rest of your body, right? You are not just a dick, you're actually one huge dick, right? You're a huge dick. You can feel from the tips of your toes to the crown of your head. Explore your body, explore what sensations are available to you. That's like the basis. And if I could put a message like out to the world, that would be my message. Is just like start to explore your body, be curious about the sensations that are available to you. And that's like the entry points, I feel like, and then everything else from there we can start to build.
Yeah, that is an absolute game changer. I've seen the same thing, coaching and also working with men and women. I notice in the women's community and like women's work, like self-pleasure rituals, and that is very common and actually like a core tenet of a lot of these, divine feminine programs or sacred sexual programs. And it's like, yes, like women pleasure, that makes sense. But then when it comes to the masculine side, some men are confronted by that. It's like self-pleasure practice. What are you talking about? Because of all the reasons you've mentioned, which, the conflation between like the mechanical and like you said, the functional and like the human body is a complete, like language is power, right? Like language is such powerful magic essentially. And it's really sad that that's happened. It's also sad that we have all these medical terms to describe these like very personal, I would say sacred, but biological personal experiences. And, all the medical terms for, genitalia and penis and, refractory period and all this stuff. It's like, it's so not filled with life force for me. And so I'm in the same way where like, we got to take back language and reframe and recommit to going into, soma, the body and the personal experience of this stuff, because that's where the power is. And I think for the masculine being, for men, that can be like one of the entry points. And I've noticed is like using this practice of like you said, your whole body and your cock to, the philosopher Jacques Lacan talked about, the phallus is like the core masculine energy. And you are, like you said, a giant cock. Like your whole experience, your mind, your consciousness is that phallic energy. But a lot of men, just trap it in one part of the body. And for you, Cam, like, because I know there's probably a lot of women watching and you probably have a lot of female followers also. How can women support their partner to like even start like in this realm and with some of the things we're talking about? Because I think that, well, the number one question I hear, and this is a cool game for you, number one question I hear by far across all platforms, where are all the good men? Kevin, where are all the good men? I can't date any good men. And I'm like, holy shit. I mean, are your eyes open? Are you aware? Because I see them everywhere. And the second question, number two, right behind it is, how do I get my boyfriend, husband, partner to do this work?
Yeah, I get that question all the time as well, actually, is, how do I support my male partner? And it's like a really lovely question, and I kind of answer it in a couple of ways, depending on how tired I am in that moment. One answer to that question is, it's his job, it's his work to do, not yours. You don't necessarily need to don't need to do the work for him, like he needs to do it. And so that's like one layer answering that question. Another layer is like, you can put things in front of him, kind of like you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make him drink. You know what I mean? Like you can suggest podcasts, you can show him my page, your page, like you can put stuff out there. But he's got to like take that initiative and be like, oh, okay, I'm going to read this book, or I'm going to like, listen to this particular podcast. A suggestion around this, like very practically, is like stick on a podcast when you're driving, and you're both in the car together, or have a conversation about, sexuality when you're out doing something physical together, like going for a walk. This is a strategy that I give to couples in general, is like if you're doing something physical together, particularly for the guy, it helps him get him out of his head and into his body. I used to kick a soccer ball around with my partner, and that's when we would have like some really open communication, about 7 years ago, start of our relationship. And now it's like a lot more comfortable for me to just like sit down and be and notice that in my body. But a lot of guys aren't there. They feel a lot more comfortable if they're moving their body. It helps them like be a bit more comfortable speaking and being vulnerable. And then another like way of answering this question, I suppose, is like almost like leading by example. It's like, you know, going and doing some sexuality work yourself, because a lot of women have the same stories about male sexuality that men have, right? Like a lot of
Right.
women that, you know, male sexuality is simple, straightforward, no strings attached. A lot of women think that ejaculation and orgasm are the same thing, and that if sex doesn't ejaculation, then sex was wrong somehow, or like there was no penetration, penis and vagina sex, then it didn't count, right? So we have the same stories because we aren't getting separate educations. We're getting the same message around male
Right.
sexuality. So you're doing a bit of your own unpacking around your own sexuality and your partner's sexuality can help invite him into that space, right? But what, you know, where you can get trapped in that is, this is something I see a lot as well, because there's heaps of women doing some incredible sexuality work, and they're climbing, right, and they're doing this amazing stuff, and then they start to then maybe be a coach to their partner as opposed to being their partner's
Right.
partner. Start going like, hey, try doing breathing exercise, doing this thing, and it's like it creates a coach-client dynamic, or, you know, a
Yeah.
therapist-patient dynamic rather than a lover dynamic. And so like to combat that, some suggestions that I have here is like having an attitude of like, so say your male partner in the moment like comes quickly or loses his erection or loses some firmness, like having an attitude of like, it doesn't matter, it's not a big deal, like I'm not leaving you, I'm not going anywhere, like, hey, we can still experience pleasure, like you've got hands, you've got a tongue, you've got feet if you're into that, you've got toys, right? We got other ways of experiencing pleasure and being intimate and connecting with one another. Like let's just keep on going. Sex doesn't have to finish when you don't have an erection anymore, or sex doesn't have to finish when you
Yeah.
ejaculate. Like the way that I conceptualize this is like reframing sex from being phallocentric to being like a lot more open. So rather than it being like whether kind of like phallocentric is just means like focused on what the penis can or can't do. So, you know, if he doesn't have an erection, it means that, you know, he can't have sex. Or if he's ejaculated, it means sex is finished. Both of those things are focused on what the penis is doing. And it's like, does it have to be that way? No, not at all. So opening and broadening your definition of sex and being like, hey, we can still be sexual. We can still be together. That, like, you know, it's positive, right? It's, you know, it's keeping positively framed. It's not like oh fuck, you know, you've got this issue, and you know, when you ejaculate, like it fucks our sex up or whatever it is. It's like, hey, we can still continue to be intimate after this. We can still, you know, continue to be pleasurable. So it keeps things positively framed, but it's also focused on pleasure as well. Yeah, right. So it's like the pleasure being the center of like the experience is what's important here, as opposed to like being goal oriented, because a lot of people get up in their head of being like, oh, I haven't achieved an erection, or I haven't, or I achieved an ejaculation too quickly. I didn't last long enough. I didn't produce you know, a long enough experience of sex. And so helping take that away, that goal orientated way of thinking about sex, you know, out of the equation, can help foster like intimacy and vulnerability and connection and ultimately pleasure, which is what, you know, call me crazy, but I think sex is supposed to be pleasurable. So it's like that's a thing to do like in the moment, is like, you know, hold that energy of like, hey, I'm still here. This is still fun. We can still experience pleasure together. Like, you know, let's continue to do that. You know, there's a lot of power in your hands as a partner. Like, you know, especially guys who maybe lose their erection, or when they ejaculate, they typically lose their erection when they ejaculate, like around their flaccid cock, right? There's a lot of insecurity that men have, and a lot of fear that men have around being flaccid, particularly flaccid in front of their partner in a sexual setting. There's a lot of fear around that. So like, you know, lovingly holding your partner's cock is like such a profound thing that you can do as a woman or as a partner that has a male partner. So like, yeah, expressing that love, expressing that like connection, and that like that compassion for his flaccid penis is like, can be a really vulnerable thing for men to receive, and really help tap into that softness and that emotionality and that deeper intimacy. I'll keep on ranting, man, but those are some like really practical things. I try and keep it relatively practical, but hopefully that lands for some people that have, you know, male partners or women.
Yeah, 100%. This is so valuable. I think people's minds are being blown right now. This is, again, this is what we should have been taught by our fathers or grandfathers, or ideally by someone in the village that could help us understand this as we hit puberty and start becoming sexual. And I really believe this is one of the keys if humanity is going to get their shit together. Because, like, imagine, you know, as a species, sexuality is what's creating new humans. It's also what pair bonds parents, who are the core unit of family and then village, community, world. And the core act, which has the most energy and the most taboo around it, is not discussed at all. And yet we have, you know, millions of pages of literature on how to market in a corporate campaign or political science or, you know, biology or physics. It's insane to me that, you know, we don't go as deep into sexuality as other things, because it's something everyone experiences. And it forms the core of a lot of our private life, but that also flows into our public life, right? If we're having good connected sex, and then you can get over to the esoteric side, it's like you really start to build up your chi or your jing or whatever you want to call it, your life force energy, cultivating that through sexuality. I mean, you're going to become a high performer, a peak performance, you know, whatever you're doing, you're in your career and your health and your wellness and your creativity. And that's the side where, like, the upper limits to practicing some of the stuff you're mentioning are infinite. Like, there's not like a limit to how much pleasure you can experience and how much health and wellness actually come in a relationship for a man or a masculine being that's going deep in this stuff. And Cam, like, what, let's bring it like really home here to like 2022 with men, dating, relationships, sexuality. What's the biggest challenge specifically this year? Let's say the last 2 years since the Rona hit. What's the number one challenge you see that men are facing?
Something that I've noticed more and more of is like men not taking ownership or responsibility for their sexuality, like this outsourcing of their experience of arousal to pornography or to their partner. And so, like, you know, a very simple example of this is something I've shared a few times is, you know, a guy is sees someone who he finds attractive, right? So he sees, so using a heterosexual example here, like a guy sees a woman who he thinks is hot, right? And he, you know, maybe doesn't say it out loud, but the way that it's often framed for a lot of guys is like, holy shit, she's so hot, she turns me on, right? Like it's her fault that he is turned on because she's attractive. So it's like the responsibility for his arousal is hers, right? But the reframe here, and what I see, you know, men struggling to do, and what I really encourage guys to do, is to go, oh wow, there's a really attractive person. I feel so turned on when I see them, right? And
Yeah.
that very, you said it before, like language is really powerful, and that's a subtle shift in language, but it shifts responsibility for his arousal onto himself. He's the one that's taking onus of his arousal. It's not her fault that he's turned on. It's his fault that he's turned on, right? And his fault, you know, that language is not super
Right.
great. It's his sexual arousal, right? It's his pleasure, it's his experience that he's having, and and from that place of like taking ownership, it's then like, all right, what do I do now? And a lot of guys go, oh God, I'm turned on. I've got to fucking do something about this. I've got to speak to her, or I've got to like have sex, or I've got to masturbate, I've got to ejaculate, I've got to like do something with this arousal to like, you know, again, produce something, to like get it out there, to like, you know, project it. And so those two things, those like, you know, that frame of like, oh, it's not my fault that I'm turned on, like I couldn't help it. And
Right.
like, now that I'm turned on, I've got to put it out there into the world. I've got to do something with it. It's got to be projected outwards. Those two things I think are like, you know, fucking up a lot of like relationships and a lot of like men's dating prospects and a lot of like, you know, the way that we relate to each other. So if guys can learn how to take responsibility for their arousal firstly, and then go, oh, I don't have to actually do anything with this. I can just feel aroused, and there's nothing wrong with feeling aroused. And I can be a sexual being out in public, and like I can be turned on, and I can engage with the world, and I can, you know, be in a state of pleasure, and, you know, maybe eventually even in a state of, you know, orgasmic bliss, you know, out in public. Then holy shit, that, it's fine. Nothing wrong with that. You're not weird, or, you're not creepy for like owning your arousal and for being a sexual human being and for not projecting that onto others by, just allowing yourself to be turned on. Being turned on feels fucking good, and there's nothing wrong with feeling good, right? But
Right.
again, aversion to pleasure, this aversion to, experiencing arousal, and, the shaming of it as well, right? Like a lot of guys have this fear of being this creepy guy, right? Of
Right.
being the guy who violates boundaries, or being the guy who's considered like, too interested in sex or whatever it is. And that's because they're like, a lot of guys aren't taking responsibility for it, and they only know how to project their arousal. They don't know how to like be with it. And so like taking ownership and then, just being with that arousal are the two like major things that I see like shifting the way that we interact with the world, I suppose, and the way that we show up as men, I guess. And that's been like a major learning for me. And it's been like a game changer for the guys I work with, and the people that like really take that information on board. So yeah, that's what I see a lot of, and that's what I think is the solution.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, accountability and ownership are superpowers for everyone, but especially for men. This is a big, big leverage point. And I would argue, and again, this takes practice to be able to contain the energy and circulate it or whatever you want to do with it. I mean, if you're creative or you're artistic or a musician, it's really easy to use arousal, which I think is our natural state. It doesn't always have to be sexual arousal, but when you're fascinated, when you're engaged with life, when you're interested, and obviously if you're sexually awakened and not just walking around the world, being with nature, being with other people, having experiences, working, talking with someone. I think that's our natural state. And the more you suppress arousal, especially sexual, that's where all those shadows come up. And, that energy is going to go somewhere. And a lot of folks, I think, they're experiencing, dare I say, the emotional turmoil, the anxiety, the depression, all the things that people struggle with. And I think I've struggled with a lot more over the last 2 years. Arousal and libido and that life force energy is nature's way, right? It's literally your body's way of using the energy in a productive way, which I think was funny is focusing too much on the productivity and like, I gotta have this outcome, I gotta come. Like, yes, that's dysfunctional, and it makes sense, right, from an evolutionary perspective, because literally men have this impulse to, project our seed, right, and plant the seed. So we can also like forgive ourselves for feeling that, that urgency or that struggle. And there's really just that inner navigation here. Honestly, you nailed it already. The bullseye is a self-pleasure practice. And this is so confronting for a lot of men. I remember for me, it was super confronting. It's like, is this feminine? Like, it's like that mind fuck, all the programming and all this stuff. And then once you get into it and you make it consistent, just like you lift weights or just like you go running, all of a sudden you're just like, oh my God, like this is, again, what we should have been taught and we should have been educated on when we all came of sexual age. And yeah, Cam, there's so much amazing stuff here. I could go on for hours on this stuff. What is the last question here for you? Just like, what is your hope or your vision? You mentioned like you would send out a message to everyone. What is your vision for, men's sexual, mental, emotional health moving forward? Like, how are you bringing that about?
I often say that curiosity should be the cornerstone of your like sexuality. I mean, it should be the cornerstone, I think, of your life, like being curious and asking questions and, exploring and experimenting. And so that's like my message, I suppose, to people, and what I would love to, like, if people take away one thing from listening to this, it's like to cultivate and to stoke your curiosity around what is like available to you in terms of like experiences of solo sexuality, in terms of like partnered experiences of sexuality as well. Like extend that curiosity to your partner, right? Be curious about their body, about their experiences of pleasure, about their boundaries as well. Be curious and ask questions about what turns them on, what turns them off, what they're into, what they're not into, right? Internalize that curiosity as well. Like, wow, what am I into? What am I turned on by? why am I turned on by that as well can be a really intriguing question. Like, is that something that really actually I like, or is it that I've been told I should like by society? Is it something that I actually enjoy doing, or is it something that I'm only doing because I'm scared of something else, right? Like, there's so much value in just like being curious about those things and deepening that curiosity, not only, you know, towards yourself, but also towards your partner, and then to people at large as well, right? Like exploring, you know, and asking questions about people and being curious about their experiences can be really valuable as well. Like, I found a lot of value speaking to, you know, gay men, to trans men, to women, to, you know, lesbian women, so people that have different experiences of sexuality and identity, and practically what sex looks like for them is a lot different than what it looks like for me. But I've gotten so much value and so much learning has happened from being curious about their experiences and asking them about it, and then being like, whoa, like my own experience of sexuality has totally changed for the better because of the information they've been, you know, gracious enough to share with me. So yeah, just being curious about like sexuality in general can be like really transformative. That would be my, like, you know, and that leads to self pleasure. Right? Curious about what your pleasure looks like, and then, you know,
Right.
being curious about where other sensations other than your genitals feel pleasure from. So yeah, that's kind of my, like, my major thing that I want to put out there.
Yeah, I love that. Curiosity provides so many degrees of freedom, and I think it's like a core, it's core to consciousness. Like if you're not curious, it's because something is like taking that energy somewhere else, right? So, you know, we know that energy flows where attention goes, and your curious attention is actually it's a gateway into so many amazing things, especially around sexuality, pleasure, intimacy. So I love that, brother. I'm there with you. Before we go here, where can obviously people go follow this man, Cam Fraser, and what do you have going on? How can people get in touch with you, work with you? What's new in your world?
Yeah, so of course my Instagram account right here. I try and be as educational as possible on social media. So like my little guarantee is if you jump on there, you'll hopefully learn something new. I try and, you know, share as much as possible. But I'm also I'm on other social medias. I'm on, you know, YouTube and TikTok and fucking Twitter and all the other ones. Same username across them all as well. So Cam Fraser. I also, you know, I'm happy to receive messages. People send me messages all the time. So if you'd like to ask me a question, I'm happy to you know, reply to messages. I've got a you know, I've got a men's course called Outperform a Porn Star, which is a bit of a tongue-in-cheek name, because I you
Yeah,
know, I kind of utilize men's idolization of porn style sex and go, you know, the sex that you're epitomizing as like the type of sex that you want to have is actually not very good sex. And I use interviews with you know, male porn stars, female porn stars, who talk about how the sex that they're having on screen is actually pretty shit and not actually very cool, and how disconnected from their experience of pleasure they are. And I say to guys, look, if you could have like a deeply pleasurable, intimate, vulnerable, multi-orgasmic, shared experiences of sexuality with another person, you'd be outperforming any porn star, man, because that's not
right.
what the having is looks like. So, so I turn, you know, performance on its head and talk about pleasure instead, and move away from function and producing things and achieving goal oriented and performance oriented to like, what if sex was just fucking pleasurable, you know, and doesn't matter what it looked like as long as both of you were satisfied with the pleasure and it was mutually enjoyable. That's what I kind of focus on, a 6-week program of like talking about self pleasuring and, you know, reframing around ejaculation and post ejaculatory experiences, and, you know, how to connect with your partner and being open and leading conversations around sex. That's what I'm really passionate about. So I'm quite happy with like the way that the course is laid out over the 6 weeks. So if people are interested in that, that'd be the thing I suggest they do, because there's a lot of like really valuable information in there. But yeah, man, that's
Amazing.
social media, and then my course. And I've got a podcast as well. I always forget to plug my podcast. It's called Men, Sex, and Pleasure. It's conversations pretty much like this about, you know, masculinity, sexuality, men's experiences of pleasure, male bodies, all that sort of stuff. So I have to get you on there, man. Now that we've had this conversation, it's prompted me to be like, okay, let's have a fucking podcast episode. That'd be great.
I'd love to. Let's do it.
Yeah, man. Excited.
Great.
Thanks for having me on, man.
Yeah, this was fun, Cam. It's amazing to get to know you more and have this conversation. Really grateful for you. And folks, like commenting, questioning, it's going to be posted over on my page. Cam will be tagged. And please share this video, tag someone who needs to hear this, tag your partner. This is such a valuable conversation. Curiosity, pleasure. You have all the practices here. If you implemented 10% of what we just discussed, your entire sex life and dating life will change. And of course, reach out to Cam or myself if you want to go deeper. Brother, I'm so grateful for you and the work you're doing, man. Big honor.
I appreciate that, man. Thank you so much, and enjoy the rest of your afternoon, mate. I'll talk to you again real soon.
I will, man. Cheers.